Welcome, everyone. Please welcome Professor David D. Friedman, who is a prime author and the most distinguished speaker and the proponent of decentralized social organization without the involvement of the state. And today he's going to be speaking about one particular aspect, namely the production and the enforcement of law in a decentralized and stateless fashion, both about the historical aspects and the possibilities of the future. This talk has been made possible by individual donations, for which I would like to say thanks for everybody who contributed. Thank you very much. And would also like you to visit and like and join the Hungarian Facebook page, a szabadság filozófiája, the philosophy of liberty, the Hungarian community for market anarchism. So thank you so much, and please welcome Professor Friedman.
I'm going to be talking about anarchy, and that is a word which means different things to different people. So I ought to start by saying what I mean. What I mean by anarchy is a society without government, and that then raises the question of what is a government? Because I am going to be describing societies that do have mechanisms for enforcing rights, enforcing contracts, settling disputes, for doing the sorts of things that we think of as the most fundamental governmental function. And then the question is, are these governments? And figuring out what is or isn't a government is a harder problem than it seems. Because as far as I can tell, there is nothing governments do that has not at some time and some place been done by something not a government. We think, for example, of invading countries as sort of a monopoly of government. But if you look at what was happening in England in the years before Alfred the Great, when the armies referred to as the Danes were ravaging England, as best I can tell, those were not national armies. They were entrepreneurial projects that a popular war leader would say, hey, let's go invade England. We can get them to pay us off for leaving. Maybe we can get some land, and a bunch of people would join him. So it's hard to think of a more fundamental government function, and as we will be seeing, lots of the government functions have in fact quite commonly been done in other ways. So the definition I prefer is to observe that in any society, people believe they have rights. And the way you can tell they believe they have rights is by how they act when somebody violates them. That generally, if someone does something I don't want him to do, I'm willing to bear some cost to stop him, but that cost is based on the value of the issue. In the case of rights violation, people are willing to bear an unreasonably large cost in order to stop somebody from violating their rights. So you can think of rights as a sort of commitment strategy. What it is will depend on the society, but that what you think are your rights are the things that you're willing to fight pretty hard to defend. That doesn't mean you never surrender, obviously. There are hopeless battles. But if you imagine that somebody says, give me your money or I'll beat you up, and you say to yourself, you do a quick sort of cost-benefit calculation, and you say, well, I've got 100 euros in my pocket. I could fight him. I'm about as big as he is. On average, fighting him will give me a cost of about 150 euros. You still fight him. If it was 10,000, you'd give up. So I think that's a way of thinking of rights as a description of human behavior, not as a moral category. And if you want a more detailed description of that, there are many of my articles on my webpage. One of them is called A Positive Account of Property Rights. It's called Property Rights only because it was written for a conference on property rights. It's really a positive account of rights. So given that definition of government, I then want to talk about societies that successfully had forms of law and law enforcement with no government. And I'm going to start with historical ones. My project for a number of recent years has been a book on legal systems very different from ours. That includes Imperial China, Periclean Athens, but it also includes modern societies such as the Romani, the Roma, who have ways of enforcing their own rules on their own people underneath the radar of the government. Groups like the Amish in the US, a variety of other such cases. And it also includes historical systems such as Jewish law and Islamic law, and lots of others. And the draft of that book is up on my webpage for comments, so you're welcome to look at it and tell me what I've got wrong. I don't have anything good on ancient Hungarian law, but if you have a good source, by all means, tell me about it. So the system I want to describe historically is what I've started calling feud law. And I should tell you that the word feud and the word feudal have no connection. They happen to sound similar, but they describe different things and they etymologically come from different origins. What is feud law? The basic logic of it is that if you wrong me, I threaten to harm you unless you compensate me. So it's a private, decentralized form of law enforcement. And if you look at feud law systems, there are about 4 conditions they have to meet in order to be workable legal systems. And the first one is that my threat to harm you is more believable if you really did wrong me than if you didn't, because otherwise it's just a form of extortion. And I think of that requirement as right makes might. There's got to be some reason why I can get away, or at least have a better chance of getting away, with harming you if you really have wronged me according to the views of our society than if you haven't. And different societies do it in different ways. The most organized feud society I have studied is Saga period Iceland about 1,000 years ago. And that was a legal system which had courts, it had a legislature, it had a law code, but it had no executive arm of government. So there were no mechanisms by which you could use anything like the state to enforce your verdicts. So in that system, what happens is that if the court says I'm in the right and that you owe me 200 ounces of silver as the penalty for something, if you don't pay, the court declares you an outlaw. It is legal to kill an outlaw. It is tortious to defend an outlaw. So if your friends defend you, they will get into legal trouble with anybody who gets hurt in the process. So if you try to resist, the coalition against you expands. And in practice, people who get outlawed, either they pay off and don't get outlawed, or they leave Iceland, or they get killed. So that was a organized system where it was the court itself that gave you the right makes might. The fact that the threat to kill somebody was much more believable after you had won the case than before. I should say, in that system, most cases settled out of court. It looks like something like 90% of all cases were privately settled. But the court existed as a threat if you didn't settle. There are other systems. One of the other feud systems I've looked at, well, let me give you the simplest one, and this is one which is still around. As you may know, the Romani, alias Gypsies, Chagani, various other names for them, left India about 1,000 years ago, and they divided into many different groups in different countries. And one of the groups, which is called the Romanachal, are the main Romani group in India today. In England today. None of them are in India as far as I know. That's where they left. But they're in England today. And there's an interesting book on Gypsy law which has a chapter on the Romanachal. And as far as I could tell, reading that chapter, the present-day Romanachal have what's really a primitive version of the Icelandic legal system of 1,000 years earlier. Because the way that system works is that if you wrong me, I threaten to beat you up unless you compensate me. It's a fairly small society. The other people around probably know whether you wronged me or didn't. If they think that you wronged me, then my friends will back me and your friends won't back you. If they think I'm just making it up, then your friends will back you and my friends won't back me. And the result is that if you did wrong me, you either pay me off or you leave town. So that's a very, very simple primitive version of the same system. And then there are various other ones in between. The northern Somali and Somaliland basically have traditional mechanisms, not for a permanent court, but for setting up an ad hoc court when a dispute arises, and that has enough respect from other people that, again, if I try to use violence against the court verdict, I'll have a harder time getting people to go along with me than with the court verdict. So the first requirement is that right makes might. The second requirement is that there is some way of getting me to carry out my threat. Because if you imagine a situation where you have wronged me, and I say I will harm you unless you compensate, and your reply is, come try. If you try to beat me up, I'll beat you up. If you try to kill me, I'll kill you. So that it's a situation where before the fact, I want people to believe that if they wrong me, I will go after them. But after the fact, it may well not pay me to do so. And what I need is a commitment strategy. And this problem, it turns out, was solved a very long time ago. That people sometimes claim that the institution of property is a creation of government, but it isn't true, because the institution of property has existed longer than the human species. There are a variety of what are referred to as territorial animals, mostly birds and fishes, who have a primitive version of property. And the way it works is that the animal somehow marks the territory he is claiming and turns a switch in his brain, metaphorically speaking, such that if another individual of the same species comes onto his property, he will fight. And he will fight more and more desperately the farther into the territory the trespasser comes. Unless the trespasser is much stronger than the defender, a fight to the death is a loss to both sides, because even the winner is likely to get injured. So if you know that this other bird or fish or whatever it is committed to defend his territory, you will usually back off, even if you're stronger than he is. So that really, as I see it, is the primitive version of property. It's very primitive. They don't have title deeds. They can't sell it. But nonetheless, it does mean they are treating a certain area as belonging to them. The human equivalent, humans have a much more elaborate version of that, in which we defend lots of things that aren't territory. And the human equivalent of that switch in the brain is the emotion we call vengefulness. We sometimes think of it as an irrational emotion. After the fact, it's irrational. If somebody harms you and you have to take a chance of getting killed to get revenge, that may be unfortunate. But the knowledge that you will do that is a reason not to harm you. So you can think of the emotion of vengefulness as a sort of a hardwired commitment strategy built into our psyche by evolution, which helps make it less likely people will violate our rights. There are other mechanisms in human society. One obvious one is reputation. If somebody steals from me and I don't carry through my threat, then other people will know that I'm fair game, that I'm a wimp, and they can steal from me and nothing will happen. So even if it's risky, I've got an incentive to carry out my threats against the person who stole from me, or cut wood in my forest, or seduced my daughter, or did whatever I regard as a wrong in that system. And then a third reason is status. Human beings care quite a lot about their status, and nobody wants to be seen as a wimp. And if other people push you around and you do nothing, you're a wimp. So all of these are mechanisms by which one commits oneself. But if you think about it, we actually need a commitment strategy that lasts past death. Because otherwise, somebody can wrong you by killing you, and you're no longer around to get back at them. And in fact, there are such strategies. That in the Icelandic system, if you kill me, my heirs inherit the claim. And my heirs then have 3 incentives to get you unless you're willing to pay weregeld, to pay the fine for killing. One of them is, again, a feeling of vengefulness. Presumably my kids don't like my being killed, I hope. Another reason is the fact that they get to collect 200 ounces of silver, which is a lot of money. And a third reason is, again, reputation. The knowledge that if you kill one of the members of the kin group, other people will get you is a good reason not to kill members of the kin group, and therefore they have an incentive to establish that reputation. The Somali have a very complicated and interesting system, which is a different solution to this problem and some other problems, in which there are a set of nested coalitions created by a combination of kinship and explicit contract. So that you're part of a member of a group, and that group is a part of a member of a group, and that group is a part of a member of the group. And they have various agreed on obligations with regard to rights violations. So that if my rights are violated, the other members of my group are committed to help me either get revenge or collect damages. If I violate rights and have to pay damages, the other members of my group pay part of the damages. If damages are paid to me, they get part of it. And I'm greatly oversimplifying. It's a fairly elaborate and interesting system. But it's all a flexible and fluid system that subgroups can pull out or go in. It really is sort of like an explicit social contract as opposed to the fictional social contracts of the societies we're used to. So those are some of the ways in which the commitment problem gets solved in real-world societies. The third problem is protecting the weak. You need some way in which people who don't have access to the direct use of violent force can nonetheless get their rights protected. And the Icelanders have my favorite solution to this problem, and it's an extremely simple solution, and that is that damage claims are transferable, indeed marketable. So we imagine that I'm an elderly man with one son, and someone kills my son. And I know that if I try to go to court to sue him to collect damages, I'll get beaten up on the way to the court. So my neighbor is a wealthy farmer with 4 big sons who went a Viking in their youth and lots of friends and relatives. So I transfer my claim for 200 ounces of silver to him. He collects it. If it's easy to collect, he may give me half the money. If it's hard to collect, he may keep all the money. But either way, the killer of my son has had to either pay damages or get killed, and that's a reason not to kill my son. So that's sort of a simple and elegant way in which you can get people who don't themselves have resources to have their rights protected, because when you violate their rights, you are creating a resource, namely their claim against you within that system. I like to point out that U.S. tort law is a privately prosecuted form of law. The enforcement is by the government, but the actual process of figuring out who damaged your car and suing him and getting damage payments is done by you or by your lawyer. And that it would be a better system in modern-day American law if tort claims were marketable. Because after all, if someone damages my car, I may not be able to afford a lawyer. And if I can afford a lawyer, I probably don't know what lawyer will do a good job. But if we only imitated the legal institutions of Iceland 1,000 years ago, I could just auction off my damage claim. Whichever law firm offered the highest price would be the one that was going to do the best job of collecting the money. And the problem is solved. So that's why I like to say that the U.S. legal system is a mere 1,000 years behind the cutting edge of legal technology. All right, my third problem that you have to solve in such a system, no, I've gotten that. That was my third. My fourth problem is terminating feud. Because one of the problems in this is that people may disagree about whether they violated your rights. All right, so I claim you wronged me, and I therefore threaten to harm you. And I want to carry out that threat for my reputation. But you believe you didn't wrong me. You believe you're innocent of my claim, and if you give in and pay me, you're now a wimp, and that's going to lower your reputation. So there's a serious risk of the kind of thing people imagine when they talk about feuds, where you have a back-and-forth case. And it turns out, if you look at real feud societies, not to be very common. But one reason it's not very common is that they generally have mechanisms when it starts to happen to stop it. And the most common mechanism is arbitration. So if you imagine you're in such a situation, you find somebody in your society who is prominent and reasonably powerful, and who people have a good opinion of, and both sides agree to accept his verdict on the dispute. And now, if his verdict is that I did wrong you and owe you damages, I don't look like a wimp for paying them, because after all, I agreed to have this judge decide the case. Furthermore, if I don't go along with what I agreed to, I've now got another enemy, the arbitrator, who's going to be mad at me. So that's a pretty effective way in which you can terminate feuds. So that's sort of a brief summary of what I could tell from looking at a variety, I haven't described all of them, of systems in which law enforcement was private and decentralized. There are lots of other systems that are partway there. As I mentioned, modern tort law is a privately prosecuted legal system, although the final enforcement is by the state. Periclean Athens, going back a bit, famous democracy, criminal cases as well as the equivalent of tort cases were privately prosecuted. In Athens, the incentive to prosecute a criminal case was that usually if you won, the prosecutor got part of the fine that was paid by the convicted defendant. And that obviously raised a problem, which was that you might look for somebody who was rich and unpopular, accuse him of something, and hope to get money. And the Athenians, who were not stupid, had a solution to this problem. They had very large juries, and if the prosecutor failed to get at least 20% of the jury to vote for conviction, the prosecutor was fined. So I like to describe the legal system of Periclean Athens as the legal system of a mad economist, because it's full of sort of clever ideas that might or might not work. But that would be another subject. Again, if you want to know about that, you can read the draft of that chapter off my webpage. So far I've been talking about historical systems. Let me now go on to talk about what was the subject of my first book, which was published about 45 years ago, where I tried to sketch out what a modern society would look like in which government was entirely replaced by voluntary mechanisms. This is what some people refer to as anarcho-capitalism or market anarchy. And I was trying to imagine how that would work, see what problems it would raise, and see what economic theory could tell me about how it would work out. So imagine a society that works as follows. Each individual is the customer of a private firm that sells the service of protecting your rights and settling your disputes. And there are many such firms. And you pay them an annual fee, just like you pay for auto insurance, and then they're the people you call if somebody robs you or if you get into some other conflict. And there's an obvious problem which everybody observes whenever you suggest this, and that's what happens in a conflict between two people who have different rights enforcement agencies. So we imagine that this pleasant gentleman has a different rights enforcement agency than I do. One day my television set is missing. The video camera that my rights enforcement agency, as part of their service, installed in my living room shows him walking out the door with my television set. My rights enforcement agency calls him up and says, "We understand you have Mr. Friedman's television set. Please return it. You owe us $50 for our time and trouble in locating you." And he says, "What are you talking about? I've got a nice television set. A friend of mine gave it to me. It's none of your business who he was. Never heard of Mr. Friedman in my life." Well, my agency says, "We're sorry you take that position, but we've got the evidence. We're pretty sure that we know that you're guilty. So 4 big, strong men are going to show up at your door tomorrow morning to retrieve the television set." And he replies, "Well, thank you for telling me that. I, too, have a rights enforcement agency, and I'm going to get in touch with them, and if 4 thugs come to my door tomorrow morning, there will be 6 valiant defenders of my rights to deal with them." So that sounds like it's setting off a small war between the enforcement agencies. But that's not what's actually likely to happen, because these are profit-making corporations, and war is expensive. If it actually happens, they'd end up having to pay hazard pay to their employees. And furthermore, they wouldn't be providing a very good service to their customers, because nobody wants to have his front lawn turned into a free fire zone. And you would much rather have a system where your rights are always protected than a system where half the time your rights are protected and half the time you violate someone else's rights and get away with it. So the obvious solution is that the two agencies agree on a private court, an arbitrator, as in my earlier case, to settle it. And they agree that if the arbitrator says it's my television set, then his agency won't protect him because they're only protecting his rights, not protecting his ability to steal things. And if it says that it's not my television set, then they will pay some damages for having imposed all this trouble through their mistake. And if you think about the situation of the firms, you can see that they are going to anticipate this situation occurring many times in the future, and therefore it makes sense for them to engage in a long-term contract in which they agree that any disputes between their members will be settled by a specified private court that they think does a good job of settling them. That's the basic system. Now, it may occur to you to say, but wait a minute, what's this nonsense about a contract? There's no government in this system to enforce contracts. You don't need a government, because one form of contract that is self-enforcing is a contract between parties who are repeat players. If you think of an agreement between two firms or two individuals who know that they're going to be dealing with each other many times in the future, each of them has an incentive to keep the agreement, because if they don't, the other side won't. So if the first time that my agency loses the court case, they say, tough luck, we're going to defend our guy anyway, then they know that the next time the same thing will happen in the other direction. They're back fighting each other, and they're going to lose their customers to some more reasonable seller of the service who's willing to keep his word. So I think of the problem of enforcing contracts for repeat players as the easy problem, which doesn't require enforcement mechanisms. And once you've got that, you can then, as it were, leverage that into enforcing contracts in general, because now each of us is the customer of a rights enforcement agency, and those agencies have agreed that either of them can use force against the other's customer if he loses the court case. So that's the basic logic of the system that I'm describing. Now, the next question is, what determines the law? Because again, we've got no government making law in this system. This is an anarchist system. And the answer is that the law is being produced by the private courts. And then the question is, what kind of law are they going to produce? And the answer is that they are producing the law to sell on the market, and they are therefore going to produce the legal rules that the customers, who are ultimately the customers of the enforcement agencies, want to be under. So imagine that there is some change in legal rules, for example, making tort claims marketable, which is an improvement for everybody. In that case, either the rights enforcement agency, once somebody suggests it, makes that change, or they lose their customers to some other agency that makes that change. Harder problem is, suppose there is a change in the legal rules which one rights enforcement agency wants and one doesn't. It's a rule that one of them, their customers favor that rule, the other they don't. Well, this is a market situation. So each agency does a little bit of market research. And one agency says, if we get legal rules that allow the death penalty, which our customers happen to like, they want to be protected if anybody kills them by his getting killed, that we would be able to collect $10,000 a year more from our customers, because they would value the service more if, in conflicts with their customers, we could guarantee the death penalty. How much is it worth to you? And the other company does similar research, and they conclude that they could collect $20,000 more if they could guarantee not to have the death penalty in disputes between the customers of the two companies. Well, in that case, they agree to not have the death penalty, and the pro-death penalty, the anti-death penalty company either makes a side payment to the pro-death penalty company or agrees to go its way on some other disputed issue. But the basic logic is that they are looking for the rules that maximize the total value to their customers, just as in an ordinary kind of market situation. This is of some interest because one of the fundamental problems with government legal systems is we do not have any mechanism to make them make good law. All right? We have what I think of as the civics class model of democracy, or the naive model of democracy. And the naive model of democracy says the politicians have to do good things, otherwise we'll vote them out. And the trouble with that is that in a society of any significant size, even as small as Hungary, let alone the US, each individual voter correctly knows, correctly believes, that his vote is very unlikely to change the outcome of an election. And figuring out what politicians are doing and what they ought to be doing is not costless. All right, it's a complicated system. The government is doing many different things. For some odd reason, politicians never run for office campaigning as I am the bad guy. All right, so you're going to have to figure out to separate the rhetoric from the facts. Furthermore, as far as I know, nobody has ever introduced a bill into the US Congress with the title, "A Bill to Make Farmers Richer and City Folks Poorer." We have such a bill every year. It's called the Farm Bill, and it's basically designed to raise the price of farm products. As you know, you have the good luck to be in Europe, which does even more of this than we do. And not that successfully in Hungary. I just got some apricots, and they were very good price. But as a general rule, the EU, I think, is worse than the US in trying to subsidize farmers at the expense of other people. But of course, when defending the bill, the politicians who support it will always explain why it's for everybody's good. That we've just got to make sure that we have, that we produce enough food, despite the fact that we are exporting large parts of our food, enough food so that if next year we have an enemy who controls the Atlantic Ocean, and an enemy who controls the Pacific Ocean, and an enemy who controls Canada, and an enemy who controls Mexico, we won't starve to death. So in any case, they don't quite put it that way, but that's the implicit logic of what they're saying. So as a general rule, it is not, in fact, in the interest of politicians to make good law. There is a branch of economics called public choice theory, which explains in some detail what the incentives of politicians are and why we get the particular kinds of bad law that we get. But my standard piece of evidence for economists is that the economics of foreign trade was worked out correctly by David Ricardo almost exactly 200 years ago. It's something called the principle of comparative advantage. One implication of his analysis is that under most circumstances, a country that imposes a tariff is shooting itself in the foot. There are some special exceptions, but as a general rule, a tariff makes the inhabitants of the country poorer, not richer. This must be true because it's something that I and Paul Krugman agree on, along with pretty much all other economists who are serious. Nonetheless, over those 200 years, there have been almost no countries that have followed out the logic and simply abolished all their tariffs. The two most notable examples are England in the 19th century, starting about 1840, and Hong Kong, which wasn't a country, in the post-war period, which was a free trade society. Those are two spectacularly successful economies. England, everybody knows about. Hong Kong, of course, is much more successful than England. Hong Kong, in physical material, Hong Kong was probably the poorest place in the world. They had a population density 10 times the density of the most densely populated country in the world, which was Singapore. They imported drinking water. They had an inflow of poor refugees from fleeing China. And between World War II and about 20 years ago, the per capita income of Hong Kong passed that of England. All right, so it looks as though indeed the rule is right, and yet nonetheless you don't get countries unilaterally abolishing their tariffs. You only get countries agreeing that we'll abolish our tariffs if you abolish yours. In other words, we'll stop shooting ourselves in the foot if you stop you shooting yourself in the foot. And it turns out that if you work out the economic analysis of the political market, that's a rational trade. That in terms of the welfare of the population, our tariff hurts us. In terms of the political benefits to the politicians, our tariffs are politically profitable to him. That the people who are benefited by the tariff are willing for various reasons to offer more than the people who are harmed. And therefore the politician is saying, I'll do something that's politically costly to me, but helps you if you do something politically costly to you that helps me. So it's a very weird case where the bargaining makes sense for the politicians but not for the population. But the general point I'm making, we can discuss it in question period if you like, is that we don't have a good mechanism to generate good law on the political market. But I've just described a mechanism that generates good law on the private market for law in my anarchist society, rather like the mechanism that generates good cars and good food and things of that sort in ordinary markets, that you're producing something for sale. It's not quite identical for various reasons, but it's close enough for my purposes. Now, one question that might occur to you is, even if this system is in some sense economically efficient, if it makes laws that maximize total benefit to the people that they affect, is it just? Well, I don't have a good theory of justice. I'm not sure anybody has a good theory of justice. But I do believe in individual freedom. And I think that, like most people who believe in individual freedom, I believe that freedom is not only morally right, it also is on the whole in people's interest. That as a general rule, it is worth more to me not to be enslaved than it is worth to you to enslave me. It is worth more to me to be free to live my life as I like than it is likely to be worth to you to control my life. So I think that although there's no guarantee, the pattern of the legal rules that would come out of what I'm describing would tend to be a relatively libertarian pattern of law. That's not a guarantee. You could imagine a society where, let's take the case of heroin. As a good libertarian, I think heroin should be legal. I don't want to use it, but if you want to use it, feel free. As far as I'm concerned, I expect your authorities would not agree. But if you imagine a society where almost everybody thinks heroin is a terrible thing, the system I'm describing is providing law on the market. If almost everybody wants law which says you can be arrested for using heroin, that's what you're going to get. But of course, under those circumstances, a political system will also give you laws against heroin, and in fact does. We've run that experiment several times now. So it's not guaranteed to be a libertarian society. In general, I think that anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism are different things. Anarcho-capitalism is a set of institutions. Libertarianism is an outcome. One of the attractive things about anarcho-capitalism is it's likely to give you a libertarian result, but it's not definitionally the same thing, and it doesn't have to. All right, there are a number of problems with this system, and since I want to go on to talk a little bit about the future, I'm just going to mention them very briefly. If people are curious, the third edition of my book, Machinery of Freedom, there's that. Why don't you show the Machinery of Freedom slide if you can, or actually show my webpage. My webpage has a link to a free PDF of the second edition of Machinery of Freedom. If you want to read the third edition, I think it's either $2.95 or $3.95 as a Kindle from Amazon. And the nice thing about Kindles, you don't have to transport them. But I discuss a number of these issues in the various editions of the book. One obvious problem is how you defend your stateless society against governments, national defense. And there are a number of imperfect ways in which you might do it. But my own feeling is that whether such a system is going to be stable depends in part on how powerful your potential enemies are. That the U.S. really has no serious enemies and hasn't had for a fair while, even though we pretend we do. Canada is a small country and rather friendly. Mexico is a bigger country and poor and reasonably friendly. And we very prudently set up our country with a very large ocean on each side. You foolishly didn't do that. But if I were in one of the Baltic republics, I would be a lot less sure that in a stateless society I could defend myself, but it's not clear they can defend themselves with the government either, given the circumstances, unfortunately. So that's one issue, is ways in which you could defend yourself. And I've got a chapter in the original book and then another chapter in the new edition discussing possible ways in which you could get the resources to defend such a system. Another problem, and one which is really economically more interesting, is internal stability. Because if you ended up with only 2 or 3 rights enforcement agencies, you can easily enough imagine the CEOs of those agencies having dinner together and discussing the trouble they've been having because their customers are very picky, and if they don't do a good job, the customers threaten to go to someone else. So how about we join? We create a cartel, or we fuse into a single firm. Now our customers have got no other alternative, so we can raise the price, lower the quality of our service, make lots of money. Basically, robbery is more profitable than business, as governments long ago discovered. So you have to worry about stability against the reinvention of government. And that's mainly going to depend, I think, on whether you have 2 or 3 agencies or 100 agencies. That it's relatively easy to set up a cartel with a very small number of players. It's hard with a large number. And that ultimately is a question for the economists in the audience of economies of scale. Does it turn out that a company providing rights enforcement services for 100 million people does a better or worse job, a cheaper or more expensive job than one doing it for 2 million people? And that's a technology question which you'd have to watch the society and see what happens. So those are 2 problems. There's a third problem, which I refer to as market failure on the market for law. And that is situations where the legal rule between you and me affects someone else. And there are a number of such situations, and in that case, the mechanism is only, we're the ones who are choosing the rule, so we're going to ignore external costs on other people, and therefore you will not get optimal rules in such a situation. But again, since the alternative is a political system that you have no reason to get optimal rules, the fact that this one is less than perfect doesn't mean it isn't an improvement. But let me go on to talk a little bit about how I think some of these ideas, or something analogous to some of these ideas, might actually turn out to be real in your lifetime. And that's the most likely way. The prediction is very hard, especially about the future, as somebody said. Maybe I'm too pessimistic, and maybe in 20 years from now, the US will be a stateless society, but I don't think it's very likely. But what you might have is a world where cyberspace is stateless, as it now more or less is, and real space has governments. That there are a set of technologies that some of you are familiar with, where the key technology is public key encryption. And if this were a talk on that subject, I'd spend much more time on the details. But the guts of it is that we know how to set up interactions online in such a way that you can communicate with a stranger with no third party able to read the communications. That's what public key encryption gives you. As an extra bonus, it also lets you prove your online identity without having to give away your real space identity, so that you can use digital signatures to show I'm the same guy who spoke to you yesterday, I'm the guy whose web page gave you some information that was valuable. You can, in fact, separate reputation. You can maintain both anonymity and reputation, which sounds like a paradox. But given that you can have an online identity with a reputation, but keep secret the link between that online identity and your real space identity, you can't arrest somebody if you don't know who he is. So that means that we've got the potential in those technologies for a world which it is very hard for governments to control. And there are more pieces of the story that some of you know more than I do about digital currencies. But in principle, one can set up anonymous digital currencies, although none of the existing digital currencies, as far as I know, is fully anonymous. We've known how to set up anonymous digital currencies for a long time. The problem is that the way that was figured out by David Chaum, I suppose 30 or 40 years ago, requires a trusted issuer. It requires a bank. All governments, or all substantial governments, are opposed to the idea of anonymous digital currency, because if you have anonymous digital currency, money laundering laws become unenforceable. Therefore, it is very hard to set up a bank when all governments don't want you to do it. And the beauty, as some of you know, of Bitcoin is that it's a form of digital currency which does not require a trusted issuer, therefore can be done even if no government approves of it. The problem is that it's not anonymous. It is, in some sense, the least anonymous money that ever existed, because every transaction is public record, although it's public record between accounts, not between people. So I'm not going to talk about that anymore. Other people here are much more involved than I am with digital currency. But the basic point is that we have a set of technologies that have the potential to give you a world where online all transactions are voluntary, where you use not physical force but reputation to enforce things. So that you can have, for example, suppose I want to hire somebody to write a computer program. We're not going to use government courts. I don't know who he is, except online. So there's a problem. If I pay him before he writes the program, I never hear from him again. If he writes the program and sends it to me for me to look at before I pay him, he never hears from me again. So we need ways of enforcing contracts, and it turns out there are very simple ways of doing it, that we write our contract, both of us digitally sign it. The contract includes the public key of the arbitrator we agree on, which is the information you need to check his signature. So if I break the contract, the programmer then complains to the arbitrator investigates the case, the arbitrator rules against me, I refuse to pay damages, the arbitrator writes out his verdict and digitally signs it, and hands the other guy a copy of that. He then has a package, the original contract which I have digitally signed, proving that I agreed to it. That contract includes the information necessary to check that the verdict is by the arbitrator I agreed to. So all he does is to put that package up on the web with my name all over it, and anybody who wants to deal with me again will check for information and discover I can't be trusted. There are other mechanisms, but that's sort of a simple mechanism by which you can use reputation rather than physical force to enforce contracts. And since online, the actual use of force isn't very practical, you can't get a bullet through a T1 line, it's really fraud and violation of contract you have to worry about, and that would be mechanisms that would do it. Now, there's an interesting extra bonus to this system. Suppose we develop a world where most of what people do is in cyberspace, where most people are earning a living in cyberspace, where most people are mostly spending money in cyberspace, where most of your friends are in cyberspace. This may sound like a crazy idea, but only if you don't know anybody who plays World of Warcraft. Because there are quite a lot of people for whom a large fraction of the hours of the day and a large fraction of their social network are already online in World of Warcraft or in a variety of other contexts. And as computers get better and networks get better and virtual reality gets better, it's pretty easy to imagine a world where for most people, most of the important stuff is online. And one result of that is that people are then very mobile. My daughter's profession is online freelance editor. And a year or so ago, she accompanied me on a trip which included India and Bali. And she was working all through the trip. She could just as easily have been at home because all her work is done online anyway. Similarly, I've been engaged in various conversations during the last 2.5 weeks as I wander around Europe with the same people I conversed with when I'm home in California, all of it online. So we have a world where most people are very mobile. Now governments are really only landlords. Because if people are mobile enough, all the government can do is to say, if you want a piece of land to be located on, we're going to charge you taxes for it. And then if those taxes are more than the real market value of the land, you find another government that offers you a better deal. So one way in which what I'm describing might happen, and I'm not a prophet, it may well not happen, is that you end up with anarcho-capitalism online, and that's what matters. And although states still control real space, the fact that they have to compete with each other for taxpayers means that they have very little power. If people want more details on this stuff, as I said, you can buy the third edition of Machinery of Freedom. If you read the second edition, or the first edition, except it's not easily findable, part 3 is where I sketch out what this system would look like and try to answer a variety of questions and potential problems with it. If you're interested in my analysis of feud law, that's one of the chapters in my Legal Systems Very Different draft, which you can get on my webpage. There it is, indeed. That's part of it. It keeps going down there. The reason student law isn't a link is that I don't have that yet. That there are supposed to be 3 chapters written by other people. One of them is on 18th century pirates. One of them is on prison gangs, each of which has its own legal system. And one of them is on the informal rules of American undergraduate students. And the guy who's doing that hasn't sent it to me yet. I hope he will eventually, because it sounds very interesting. But in any case, there are some more. And one of the chapters, as you can see, is called Feud Law. And that's where I sort of discuss these different societies, which I've given examples of in the other chapters, and the logic of feud law and how it works. Finally, if you're interested in my general views on the future, there is a book I wrote called Future Imperfect. It's webbed. You can read it for free off my webpage. As a general rule, if my publisher lets me, I usually web my books, because I write books mainly in order to spread ideas, not mainly as a source of revenue. Not that you never get any revenue. After all, one result of writing books and putting them online is that nice people invite you to come to Budapest and give a talk. They even pay for your hotel and other places and other times. But basically, my books tend to get webbed. There are also a whole lot of my journal articles are up on the web if you want to read those, including the one on a positive account of rights. In addition to that, this talk is currently being recorded, video recorded. Many of my talks have been video or audio recorded, and my website has a page which has got, I suppose, recordings of maybe 40 or so different talks I've given. So if you want to hear what I think about other things, my favorite title is Should We Abolish the Criminal Law? And I've given that one a few times, but I've got another version which is partly about global warming and related issues of that sort, and others on a bunch of other fun topics. So there's lots of stuff on the webpage. I think that finishes what I wanted to say. I concluded long ago that the advantage of a question period is that when you're answering a question, you can be pretty sure at least one person in the audience is interested in what you're talking about. So I will now terminate the monologue part of this talk and turn it into a sequential duologue. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
I have the theory that it is inevitable. I have the theory that it is inevitable that a monopoly of power in societies will emerge. That there will always be the stronger ruling over the weaker. For sure, you have written something
how
about.
do you explain the fact that it's never happened? You may have noticed there's more than one country in the world. Your logic would appear to apply there as well. And even within a single country, governments usually claim a monopoly of force, but the fact that there is, in fact, theft, tax evasion, all sorts of other things means they don't really have a monopoly of force, and that even fairly powerful governments, there are other people with some power. But the simplest case is just the international case. If your argument was really true in general, the world, well, at least the continent would all, there was a time when you couldn't get to the New World, but the continent, Eurasia would always have been one government. It's never been one government or close to it.
But what I think is, for example, now the US is wrecking a boat with 1,000 military bases, international military bases are in the world. So it's one of examples that sooner or later some entity will get so powerful that will start colonizing everybody else. And after the US will fall apart, some other entity will be.
The U.S. has lots of military bases, but you will notice that when the U.S. actually tries to do anything, it is not able to control the rest of the world. That the U.S. pretty clearly believes that the Russians should not be causing trouble in the eastern Ukraine, probably that the Russians should not have annexed the Crimea. Nonetheless, they did. And the U.S. really thinks that the guy who's presently running Syria shouldn't be running Syria. He's still there. So the U.S. can certainly influence things, but it's way, way short of all powerful, which is probably a good thing on the whole. And similarly for other things that, so no, I don't, no, the degree to which you get your pattern, again, goes back to the kind of point I was making about economies of scale, that there are some times and some military technologies in which there are large advantages to being big, and then you're going to get closer to what you're saying, and others where it's gone the other way. That after all, the Roman Empire controlled, I suppose, pretty much the bulk of Europe, not all of modern Europe, plus the Middle East, plus the North Africa. It collapsed, and it wasn't replaced by another big country. It was replaced by, 5,000 baronies, essentially, and for quite a while, you had very small. My first published journal article, as it happens, was an attempt at an economic theory of the size and shape of nations, trying to explain that pattern. So I don't think it's as simple as you're saying. There certainly is the issue of under what circumstances you do or don't get one strong thing, or 10, or 100, or 1,000. But I don't think it's as simple as you always get one.
Thank you.
Another question? Yes.
My question is also about your perception of a likelihood of a certain scenario that currently there's, as you said, a lot of law enforcement that the government treats as crime, but actually these are feud systems under the radar. And most of the people in this room have the experience that there used to be a black market in the socialist system, but then there occurred a phase change, and now that black market is the market. And at some point, I find it plausible to be a development where the decentralized law enforcement suddenly becomes the law enforcement and the regular taxation becomes a crime. Do you see that as a distinct possibility?
It's possible. You've probably read Snow Crash by Stephenson, which is sort of a tongue-in-cheek future history science fiction novel in which there are still people in the US who go to large buildings and pretend to be a government, but they're no longer controlling anything. And that's possible. I think my guess is that the right way to get in that direction is not by having a revolution to abolish the government, but just by gradually replacing one part after another. And you could certainly imagine a situation where it is true that you could call the police when somebody robs you, but you know perfectly well it'll be 3 hours before they arrive and they won't do any good. And therefore, what you really do is to call your rights enforcement agency. That might happen, it may not happen. I remember when we were subject to a robbery in Chicago a good many years ago, that it was pretty clear, talking to the policewoman who came, that her view was that the only reason anybody ever reported robberies was to the police was to get the documentation for their insurance claims. And I think she was the one who commented that the consequence of making marijuana illegal was to make robbery legal, because the police had only a certain amount of time and effort. I don't swear that was the same person. But, so yeah, you could, but more generally, I think the path you want is a path in which you are gradually replacing governmental institutions by private institutions. And that's going to be easier in things other than law enforcement, but even in law enforcement, after all, there's a lot of private arbitration already for settling disputes. Probably most commercial disputes are settled privately. There's a lot of informal, the use of social norms rather than laws to control things. Maybe, I hope. Another question? Yes, way back.
Hello. I was wondering, I have a lot of friends who work for governments, and I get paid by government sometimes in my work. And I was wondering, how do you talk to people who are in the employ of the government? How do you address those people? I'm not being provocative. I'm asking how you address those people.
I understand. Let me make what seems a different point but isn't really. And that's the economist's question, what's wrong with theft? That economists tend to evaluate legal rules by the net effect on people. And it's tempting to say, well, when you steal $100, I'm $100 worse off, you're $100 better off. That's a wash. Why should we care? And the economist's answer is that if by spending time and energy picking pockets you can steal $100, then if it only takes $10 worth of efforts to steal $100, then stealing is a profitable profession. More and more people go into it. As more people go into it, it becomes less and less profitable, that you pick somebody's pocket but it's empty because someone beat you to it 3 minutes before. People stop carrying much money in their pockets, similarly for other things. And the equilibrium is reached when the marginal thief is spending $99.99 to steal $100, at which point, on net, the thief is making the society poorer by the amount stolen. Possibly more than the amount stolen because the victim is also spending some resources protecting himself. This is what economists call rent-seeking, spending resources not on producing something, but on making sure you have it instead of someone else. So if that's right, it is quite likely that it would be in the interest even of the thieves to make theft impossible. Because if you make theft impossible, it's true that they will have to go to working at McDonald's for $5 an hour instead of stealing for $5.50 an hour. But on the other hand, nobody was stealing from them. Grocery store prices will be lower because no one's stealing from the grocery store, and therefore it's quite likely that they will be better off. The same argument applies to governmental theft. That is to say that it's very hard to really give things away, because when you give things away, people compete to get them. And therefore, the person who is working for the government is probably somebody, maybe at this point he'd be worse off if the government was abolished because he's spent resources becoming an expert on working for the government. But if he goes back a little bit in his career, he could have forked out in a different direction, used the same talents, made almost as much, not as much, because that's why he went to government, and he would be in a society in which the government was not eating 40% of the national income, which is, I guess, a modest figure. I think most of Europe, it's a little higher than that, but it depends on the country. And therefore, having your relative income go down by 5% and absolute income go up by whatever, 80% or so, is likely to be a gain. Now, if you abolished government instantly, that argument wouldn't work too well because people have invested sunk costs in their present position. But if all you're doing is saying, we're going to gradually whittle away the government, then figure that with luck, at the point when your part disappears will be the year after you retire, and you won't be bearing the costs of your replacement. I guess that would be the kind of answer that I would make. Another question? Yes.
Hello. Sorry. Sorry.
All right.
My question would be, what is your stance on the Libertarian Party of the United States, as they reached the best result in 2016 since the 1920s any third party could?
Yeah, my view has always been that the function of the Libertarian Party is not to elect people, but to spread ideas. And the analogy I normally offer, which I did not invent, is to the most successful American political party, which is, of course, the Socialist Party. That the Socialist Party has never elected, I think, anything more important than the mayor of Milwaukee, if I remember correctly. I think it was Milwaukee. But on the other hand, if you look at the Socialist Party's platform at the beginning of the 20th century and the Republican and the Democratic Party platforms at the end of the 20th century, you discover they've gotten almost everything they wanted. So in my view, the way that if we win, the way we will win is that we get a few votes and the Republicans or the Democrats say, well, you know, those libertarians are peeling off 4 or 5 percentage points of the votes. That's enough to determine which of us wins. I wonder if there are any of their ideas that we could steal. And if you're really lucky, the Republicans and the Democrats both steal the same idea, so then you've got that one, and then you continue with that process. And I think that's the strategy that one ought to be aiming at the moment. I've for quite a while been arguing that I hope it occurs to the Democrats to try to pull libertarians out of the Republican coalition, because the Republican coalition hasn't been doing much for libertarians for quite a while. Libertarians are a fairly small minority, but they're a large enough group so that if all the libertarians who vote Republican voted Democrats, that would essentially give the Democrats the next several presidential elections, because it would be, a shift of maybe 5% or 4%, something like that. I'm using libertarian in the fairly weak sense of people who generally are in favor of both more economic freedom and more social freedom, not hardcore people like me, a much smaller number. And ideally, I would like to have the Republicans and the Democrats competing for our votes, at which point they will find whichever policies are most popular with us and least unpopular with their current base and try to annex them. That would be the policy that's what I want the LP to do, and I've been saying for a long time. And ultimately, if we are really successful, then the LP will disappear. We will no longer need it because the other parties will be doing our work. And I remember at one point, a very long time ago, saying it was sort of like a Coke can that, once you've drunk from it, you can throw it away. And for some reason, the gentleman who had been the most recent presidential candidate of the Libertarian Party did not think that was funny. But anyway, more questions? Yes. Oh, fine. Yeah.
You are proposing a market solution to many problems, and what do you think about the efficiency of markets? Because
the what?
Efficiency of markets. Because 2 decades ago, tech companies were mispriced by the markets, and then it was solved by those companies going bankrupt. And 1 decade ago, real estate was mispriced by markets, and then they were foreclosed and it was solved. And what if human life is mispriced by the markets? What will happen then?
I guess my basic answer is that as far as I can tell, markets are more efficient than any other way we have found of solving the coordination problem, of organizing complicated societies. They're certainly not perfect, but as an economist, I tend to assume people are rational, and that therefore the fundamental reason why markets give the wrong answer is that there are situations where individual rationality does not produce group rationality. And that, I think, is a useful definition of market failure. And the reason individual rationality does not produce group rationality is that there are situations where an individual is making a decision where a considerable part of the net cost is borne by somebody else, or net benefit, either way. So if I'm making a decision where I get a $10 benefit and an $8 cost, and you get a $6 cost, it pays me to make it even though we're worse off. Similar in the other direction. If I have make a decision where I get a $10 cost and an $8 benefit, and you get an $8 benefit, it doesn't pay me to make it, even though making it would be worth doing. That's the fundamental problem of market failure. If you think about comparing the private market to the political market, that situation is the exception on the private market. That ordinary private market transactions, if I want inputs, I've got to pay for them. If I want your labor to make something, I've got to pay you enough so that you'd rather do that than anything else. On the ordinary market, if I produce something, I sell it to the person who values it, which gets me an amount of money representing its value to him. So the sort of first approximation to the private market is a system where each person is bearing all of the net costs, receiving all of the net benefits. And it's only at the second approximation that you get things like externalities and public goods, where that's not true. If you think about the political market, on the other hand, the normal situation is the market failure. It is almost never the case that a political actor actually bears the costs or receives the benefits of his action. And that applies whether the political actor is an individual voter, who gets, if he does do all the work of figuring out how to vote to and vote for the right guy, and if that helps, he shares that benefit with 10 million other Hungarians. And it applies to a judge. If a judge sets a precedent which lowers the national income by 1/100%, that's a huge amount of damage for one human being to do, but he'll never know. And similarly for legislators. So I would have said that as a general rule, shifting decisions from the private market to the political market makes it more likely, not less likely, that you'll get bad results. So that would be the simple answer, that, it takes a candidate to beat a candidate, and I don't think we have any better way. Now, one other sort of fancier point for the economists, and that is that there are trade-offs between market coordination and centralized coordination. And the existence of those trade-offs is the reason that firms exist. That if it were really the case that market coordination always dominated, then every firm would consist of one person, and all coordination will be done on the market. And Ronald Coase has a very famous article, The Theory of the Firm, in which he makes that point, in which he points out that if you really carry all the way through the simplifying assumptions of the market, firms disappear, that therefore what's going on is that there are transaction costs on the market, which result in there being some costs of doing things on the market. There are costs of trying to coordinate things hierarchically in non, and you then get firms tending to be that size, at which if they were any bigger, the cost of doing things in-house would be higher than on the market. If they were any smaller, the other way around. So, and of course, one of the advantages of the market, which you've just pointed out, is that firms can go bankrupt. So when they make enough mistakes, they disappear. It's much harder for governments to go bankrupt. Another question? Someone want to hand out there's somebody right there, nice and close to you.
So under the system of private law enforcement agencies and private courts, if I got that correctly, it's impossible for me to know what law I will be judged under before committing a crime. Do I see that correctly, and is that a feature?
That's an overstatement, but it's an overstatement of a correct point. That is to say, to begin with, if you know who the person you're committing the crime against is, then you could check on what rights enforcement agency he uses. Furthermore, there's going to be some tendency to uniformity because it lowers costs. It's easier to hire lawyers if they don't have to memorize 50 different systems. So just as in lots of market contexts, you get standardization occurring on the market, but in this system, you'll have a mix of standardization and diversity, so that you will have some cases where there are some areas, if you're in an area where water is very scarce, you're going to want a much more elaborate set of rules for water rights than if you're in an area where water is plentiful. So there's going to be a mixture of partly standardization, partly diversity. But of course, this is true already in a modern system. I don't know about Hungary, but in the US, large parts of our legal system are state law. If I engaged in say, a tort conflict with you, you might say, well, we know what state it happened in. But imagine that what's going on is an accident with a car that occurs in California, was bought in Massachusetts, and was manufactured in Michigan. You have to go to a lawyer familiar with diversity jurisdiction to figure out whose law applies. So to some degree, that happens already. No, one of the things that I actually discussed in the new book, not yet published, is what I think of as polylegal systems, as systems where the same territory has multiple legal systems operating on it. And there are a fair number of historical examples. To some extent, church law and state law in the Middle Ages in Europe. As you may know, Sunni Islam, there are 4 mutually orthodox schools of law. And in principle, you could have a situation, sometimes did, where a major medieval Muslim city had courts for all 4 schools of law. And then you have the issue of how do you decide. It's easy if the 2 parties are adherents of the same school, which they often are, because it tended to be one community adhering to one. And if they didn't, then it's going to depend. The rule might be that you go to the defendant's court. The rule might be that you go to the court that the ruler likes. The Ottomans basically eventually subverted the system. They supported one of the 4 schools. In the core Ottoman areas, only that school was functioning. In the less core areas, the other 3 schools existed, but that school had advantages. So, no, historically, you do get systems of that sort. Another question? Fine.
I would like to refer a part of your lecture about heroin.
Yes.
That there is a place, you told, where people generally think heroin is harmful, and that's why they prohibit it. But is it possible to prohibit me to consume heroin by the majority, if I want to? And I have no victims, of course.
That is, it obviously is possible because it's happening at the moment.
Okay,
Right.
may.
What?
No, but...
I don't think it's morally correct, but it's possible.
No, I didn't put the question correctly. May a majority prohibit. Technically, it's possible.
I don't think it is morally legitimate to do so. But then I do not know of any way of appointing God as judge and having a legal system which is guaranteed to only have morally legitimate parts of it.
Yeah, but if even anarchy can't help me consume heroin if I want, where shall I go?
I would suggest that if you want to use heroin, you do it discreetly and don't let people know you're doing it. That's the usual solution. But no, but under anarchy, if there is strong enough support for a non-libertarian law, you're going to get it. But under any other system, if there's strong enough support for that, unless you imagine a system where you're a dictator, which isn't sort of hard to maintain. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not a utopian. I don't claim there are institutions that give all entirely just results, merely institutions that give closer to that than any other institutions, and that's all the claim I'm willing to make. Another question? There's somebody way at the back.
Just a quick comment on the last question, that if you want to shoot heroin, just come to my place and I will hook you up. So, a serious question. You mentioned...
I assume the questions as well as my talk are being recorded.
Yeah, that was just a joke, obviously. So my question would be about private cities, that you mentioned that there is a possibility in the future to freedom-loving people to get away from the government in the cyberspace, but we can all hear about private city projects. I'm sure that you are familiar with them in like floating cities on the ocean or in rural parts of Sweden. So my question would be, what do you think would be a few important characteristics for a private city project to be successful, when success is defined as being able to maintain a legal system and defense, of course, from other like governments, and yeah, just a few characteristics and your thoughts on that project.
Well, I have the possibly biased opinion that the most attractive of this project is the seasteading version because it's the most flexible. That is, if you can pull it off, having a form of floating housing which is competitive with ordinary housing, the beauty of that is that you can continually reform your communities. So if you've got a town of 20,000 people under some set of rules, and whatever their decision-making mechanism is gives a result that 4,000 of them don't like, they call up the tugboat companies, pull their rafts away, do a little research and find 3,000 people in another community who agree with them and reform. So ideally, if you want a system with sort of a competitive market to generate good rules, it would be nice if it was more fluid than the tied down geographical ones. And that's really the part of it that I've thought of. I'm a little bit prejudiced because this, of course, is my son Patri's idea. It probably won't work. Most clever ideas probably won't work. But hopefully, you know, one of them eventually will. And the various proposals for startup cities and such are not likely to be as libertarian as we would like, but might well be more libertarian than other things. I mean, Hong Kong was a good deal more libertarian than China, and even indeed more libertarian than the United Kingdom, even when the United Kingdom was running it. So, other questions? Somebody over there?
Okay, so in your book, The Machinery of Freedom, there's a chapter about where you advocate for unschooling and homeschooling. Yes. But in the context of the whole book, it seems like you are advocating against compulsory education. What's your opinion about that? And
I would sometimes claim that the only form of compulsory education I know of is the draft. That being a slave for a couple of years is doubtless a very educational experience. But compulsory schooling does not strike me as a desirable institution, if that's what you're talking about. His reference is to the third edition, which has got, because the chapter in question isn't in the second edition. And it's a discussion of an approach to schooling in which the kids basically control their own time. And so you are encouraging your children to learn interesting things, but it's up to them whether to do it or not to do it. And that's, now Patri is the son of my first marriage, and he was brought up mostly by his mother and her second husband, although he spent summers with us. But the two children of my present marriage were mostly almost entirely unschooled. We were reasonably happy with the results. The one exception we made was that we bullied them into learning the multiplication tables. And my daughter's opinion is that that was a mistake, that that really wasn't very useful skill nowadays anyway. So if you're interested in that, if you want to, that is, you can either read that book, or if you go on my blog and do a search for unschooling, I've got 2 or 3 long posts in which I'm discussing partly my reservations about the standard schooling model, which doesn't seem to me to make very much sense, and then that particular different model, which I like. But kids are different. And so I would not want to claim all kids would be better off with unschooling, just that the observation is that some of them are, and in some ways it's a much more attractive model. Yes? Yeah.
Yes. So my question is about blockchain technology. There's a second wave of that after Bitcoin that allows smart contracts to be encoded in a I don't want to become too nerdy, in a decentralized way, and some adherents of that, who are both anarchists and IT specialists, quite a combination, believe that that might be a chance for a sort of legal system to emerge without a state. What, if anything, do you think about that?
Well, I know a little bit more about it than I did at 9 o'clock this morning, having driven from Graz to Budapest with people involved in that project. And it's certainly an interesting project. The connection between sort of cyber people and anarchists is not all that new. I was sort of a peripheral member of the group that were referred to as cypherpunks in Usenet quite a long time ago, and the way I like to put it is that the person who was sort of one of the leading figures there stole a bunch of ideas from me, from machinery, and reprocessed them, and I then stole his version back and used it for some articles on crypto anarchy. Strong privacy is the term I generally use. So no, I think it's an attractive possibility. It's got some obvious problems, which we discussed. That is, the big problem to me with smart contracts is how you get into your computer system facts about the real world. How do we discover whether I have really performed what I claim to perform? And clearly people have some clever ideas about that, and whether they're adequate, I'm not sure. But that's an interesting thing, which I've been thinking about today. Other questions?
What happens in your model if somebody finds a dead body on the streets, for example? We don't know who is that, we don't know whose law firm is that, and my second part of my question is, what happens when, for these law firms to succeed, they need to access to databases of data, as the police and other organizations can.
To answer your first question, my guess is that all of the rights enforcement agencies in the area have a policy of offering a bounty for information showing that one of their customers has been killed. Because after all, they want to protect their customers, and part of protecting their customers is if you are killed and your body is dumped somewhere, we'll find out about it and do something about it. So I would expect that when you find the dead body, you say, all right, what can I tell about this body? Which are the rights enforcement agencies who have customers in the area? Let me get in touch with each of them and say, I've got this dead body here. It might be one of your people. I understand that you'll pay $5,000 if it is. Here's the information. Come look at it. So I would expect that that would be the kind of approach that it would be in the interest of the rights enforcement agencies to use. With regard to data, I presume that the rights enforcement agencies will have contractual agreements on sharing data, that if we find somebody who there is good reason to suspect violated the rights of your customer, we will be happy to sell you that information, or maybe we'll give it to you for free because you do the same thing for us. That firms quite often have arrangements of that sort among themselves. With regard to other forms of information, I would think it would only be a question of contract, that when I buy stuff from Amazon, Amazon may or may not include in their contract with me that they will not tell anybody else what I bought. And you would see that on the one hand, a rights enforcement agency might say, one of our people has been poisoned. We'd like to know who has been buying the relevant kind of poison from Amazon. On the other hand, I might also, the flip side of that is that I might want people not to know about things, for whether I'm doing illegal or legal things. So that seems to me the kind of issue that just gets settled on the market by how valuable it is to the people the information is about to keep it private, and how valuable it is to other people to have that information.
Thank you.
As you may know, in the US at least, what actually happened was that the telephone companies had a legal obligation to their customers not to share the information. They shared the information with the government security people anyway. They were sued, and Congress then changed the law to immunize them. Yes, another?
So I'm a huge fan of your work. I would like to have your opinion on a disturbing tendency in the developing world that I think that more and more people are getting dependent on government, especially like in the countries that have an aging population. And I think that this is this doesn't create demand for freedom, really. And what is your opinion on that? How it will be solved in the long run, probably, because it's pretty horrible. For example, in Hungary, like 94% of the retirees are on government funds, and the government is like almost completely clearly bankrupt. And I don't see it as a huge. I don't
know enough about Hungary to offer any opinions. I would point out, however, that there are something over 1 billion people in China who are a great deal less dependent on government than they were 50 years ago. That's a very large change in the opposite direction. It's a bigger change, and I think my guess is, yeah, I'm pretty sure the population of China is bigger than the population of Europe. More generally, the world is always moving in all directions at once. That things are getting worse, things are getting better. So that what used to be the biggest threat was socialism, intellectually speaking, quite aside from military things. That what used to be, I think, the most dangerous idea was the perfectly obvious idea that in order to organize things, you've got to have somebody at the top giving orders. And that was a mistake. And at this point, that idea is almost dead. You can never really kill bad ideas, but you can come close. That the combination of a little bit of people actually thinking about it and seeing why decentralized coordination was possible, plus the experimental evidence, the fact that India, with its 5-year plans, did not get rich, that Russia, with its 5-year plans, stayed poor, that meanwhile Taiwan and Korea and Singapore, with basically market systems, did get rich. And then the sort of final stroke when China abandons communism, and from the time Mao dies to 2010, real per capita income in China goes up 20-fold. So that was a pretty striking set of events, with the result that I think in India today, the reason they don't have a full free market system is not that the people in charge of it still believe in central planning. It's that there are lots of people whose income depends on handing out government favors, and it's a slow and difficult matter to unravel that system. So that part we won. At the same time, environmentalism appeared to replace socialism. That is to say, a new set of arguments against the market came in. In one sense, that was an improvement, in another sense, not. Intellectually, it was an improvement because environmentalism was a better argument than socialism. That socialism only worked if you didn't understand economics. You can still understand economics and believe in environmentalism. At the same time, environmentalism in practice, I think, gets often used to make excuses for doing things that there's no good argument for doing, and therefore provides a substitute for socialism in justifying government interference with people, which I don't think it ought to justify. So that's one example where I'm saying worlds where things are moving in both directions at once, and I think that's usually the case. Other questions?
Thank you for the talk. Firms compete on a lot more than just price and quality of product. So they often compete, for example, on appearing socially conscious, for example, by protecting the environment or contributing to charities. And the business of rights enforcement is often very brutal. So if you remember the case of a couple of months back, I think, with the United Airlines case, where a man was dragged, of course, off a plane, you'll get a lot of cases that look like that, at least on a superficial level. So I'm wondering if you might not end up with companies competing to be bad at their jobs of protecting people in certain ways, just because it makes them look bad.
That is the problem with using the desire to look good to control behavior, is that it's a little bit like the voting problem. That is, knowing whether a company is really doing good things is usually not easy to do, because the company always wants to look as though it's doing things. Knowing whether a company is doing bad things is not always easy to do, because reporters want to make a good story out of something and therefore are likely to give the part of the story that makes it sound as though the company was doing something outrageous. And the individuals who are doing the enforcement by buying or not buying from that company have very limited incentives to get good information. The problem with reputational incentives in general, and there are some other interesting cases like this, is if you hire somebody to build a building, his reward depends on on how good a job he does at building the building. But reputational enforcement is a side effect. That if the company I buy a jacket from, refuses to take it back even though they said they would, I tell people when they stop buying from that company, the reason they stop buying from that company is not that they're trying to punish it for mistreating me. They don't want to be mistreated themselves. So that the enforcement part is really almost an accident, though a happy accident. And the problem with that is that because it's an accident, it may not be an incentive to do it. So if you imagine the case where you've cheated me and I complain, and it's not, and you of course say you didn't, you say I'm the one who cheated, it's not easy for an interested third party to figure out who's telling the truth. And so a prudent third party will say, well, one or the other of them is dishonest, I don't know which, so I won't deal with either of them. And if I anticipate that, I never report you're cheating me, because it just hurts me. So that means that in order for reputational enforcement to work, you need low-cost ways in which interested third parties can find out who is at fault. And that's really the point of the mechanism I was sketching by using digital signatures and arbitrators, in such a way that you can find out who broke the contract at the cost of a second and a half of computer time to just check all the digital signatures. And so the mechanisms you're describing may do some good things, but I don't think they are a very reliable way of keeping companies from behaving badly or making them behave good. It's going to be awfully tempting for the company to think of something that sounds really good if you don't think about it, of which there are many such things, and do that even if the real effects are not good.
Now that we're talking about reputation, and you mentioned the reputation's role in the kind of digital cyber world, I would like to have a remark on that, or a question. So you mentioned that if you do not comply with the contract that you previously agreed to, then your reputation suffers. However, with online identity, the problem is that your identity is actually replicable. So that's called a Sibyl attack, maybe, or if you want to be technical. So you basically can create another identity. Yes. In general, the description of the problem is that reputation only makes sense if there's long-term, basically an expectation that you have a reputation for long-term. However, to establish that, you need some sort of bootstrapping.
Yeah, there are two answers to that. The first, which I think you're really suggesting, is having a reputation is valuable. And one way you get it is you start out by making small transactions where you only have a small temptation to cheat. Don't cheat on those, and over time you reach the point where people trust you for larger transactions, and the fact they trust you is profitable to you, and you therefore don't want to throw away your reputation. And sort of the classic case of this is the diamond industry, where at one time the New York diamond industry was dominated by Orthodox Jews who were unwilling to sue each other, but nonetheless had enforcement mechanisms through trusted arbitrators, largely rabbis, such that if you were in that industry, you would start out small, and at the point at which somebody would trust you with the opportunity to cheat them out of $100,000, your reputation was worth another $100,000 to you. So that's one answer. And there are a number of other ways of doing this that you're probably familiar with. The other possibility is that you can rent a reputation. So if you go back to my arbitrator story, suppose that you have two people who are contracting and neither of them has a reputation. So therefore, neither of them loses much if he's proved to have cheated. However, the arbitrator has a reputation. The arbitrator is a repeat player, and people value the fact that they can trust him. So each contracting party deposits $5,000 with the arbitrator, and if the arbitrator's verdict is that I owe you $3,000, he takes $3,000 of my dollars and gives it to you. So that's a case in which you're renting somebody else's reputation because neither of you has it. And in the real world, a lot of this happens in a less formal and rigorous way than I'm describing. If you look how eBay works, for example, eBay has mechanisms to transmit information about reputation of sellers, and they seem to work pretty well. And you've got the possibility of escrow agencies where the thing you buy doesn't go to you, it goes to somebody else. The money doesn't go to him. You inspect the product. Once you approve the product, the money goes one way and the product goes the other. And that's a real-world example of you're trusting the escrow agency because they could just keep the product, but you don't have to trust either of the two parties. Another question?
Yeah, I would like to have a second one. Yeah. So usually when I'm kind of vaguely familiar with your, well, not vaguely, but actually familiar with your arguments, and when I present it to people, I often run into an argument along the lines of, you said that the small number of private protection agencies can have dinner together and like cartelize on the one hand, and on the other hand, like the rules themselves can pretty much be expected to standardize over the long term, because for people living in one community, it's kind of better. And given the fact that there's no guarantee for kind of any kind of liberty, this might sound like almost like a recipe for the emergence of government. And I'm often like faced with an argument saying that, like, well, I mean, it's all hand wavy to say that it's like the market of law. After all, it's going to be exactly the same or like equivalent.
Well, we do have a fair number of real-world examples of societies that maintain decentralized systems for hundreds of years. I mean, the Somali did until basically the rest of the world started trying to force them to have a government, and they were sort of heavily outnumbered, and the rest of the world hasn't really succeeded yet. The Romanichal, the Icelanders had a sort of semi-stateless system that lasted for something over 300 years, longer than the US system has lasted so far, at least. So I don't think you can consistently predict that it will break down. The problem is that we don't have any examples of modern developed societies that are stateless, and maybe the answer is that under current circumstances they're unstable. A long time ago, I gave a talk on the subject of Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, at a Libertarian Party convention with Nozick in the audience. And we ended up with an exchange like this one after the talk. He didn't try to defend the argument that he had made in the book about why you wouldn't end up with anarchy. He instead fell back on what I thought was a stronger argument, which is to say, look, in the world as it exists, we observe zero examples of stable, stateless societies of the sort you describe. And that's true, unfortunately. On the other hand, my usual response is to say, suppose it were 1750, and I was a very imaginative fantasy political scientist, and I said, there's this great form of political organization I've thought of. You may not believe this, but this is going to be a society where the rulers are elected by majority vote, and all adults get to vote, even women. And it's going to be a system where all adults have the same legal rights, even blacks and women. And foreigners, well, some foreigners who've been here long enough. And it's going to be a society, I mean, I know this clearly couldn't happen, in which the government collects and spends something between 30 and 60% of the total national income of the society. And of course, the people to whom I suggest to say, well, look, this is a very interesting fantasy, but look around you. Nothing like that has ever existed in the history of the world. It's clearly impossible. And yet that, of course, is the current standard political system of the developed world. So circumstances change, and part of the point of my discussion of the cyberspace argument is to suggest that there may be technological changes that are going to make it more possible to maintain this kind of system. And similarly, the discussion we had, the reference very briefly to the way in which blockchain systems can be used for smart contracts, suggests ways in which the government functions may be undercut by new technologies that provide better replacements for what they're doing.
Yeah, you pointed out that most of the social cost from theft comes from rent-seeking. But it seems to me, and maybe others have already raised this issue, and you've answered it before, I mean, not this event, of course, that the victims of theft do not internalize all the costs.
Victims of theft, what?
The victims of theft, they do not internalize all the costs of social costs, of the full social costs of theft. So it seems to me that they have insufficient incentives to sue.
Why do they not internalize the social costs? Who else is, that is, the legal system pretends that all crimes are crimes against the state. As I like to tell people in the American context, you can never be the victim of a crime, legally speaking. If somebody robs me or assaults me, when the case gets to court, it will be the state of California versus. But in fact, I would have said that most crimes, most of the cost is borne by the victim. Why not?
You know, because I mean, the victim spends on property protection, right?
Yes.
And the thief spends his or her resources on stealing. So basically, they both spend resources which they could have used. Which they both spend resources which they could have spent more productively. So the full social cost is not fully borne by
I don't
the
understand.
victim.
When I waste my resources, that is a cost to me. The result of the thief spending his time is that, well, the result of the victim spending his time is that he has less money. The thief, it is true there is a net social cost, which is why you want rules against theft. But in terms of the cost of the act of theft, it seems to me that that cost is a cost to the victim. No, he's the one who loses stuff. Anyway, I'm not sure if I understand your argument, so maybe I'm being unfair to it. Interesting case, which I spend one of my chapters on in the new book, is 18th century England, where criminal prosecution was private. The enforcement of verdicts was public, unlike Iceland, but they didn't have cops or public prosecutors in our sense. And so if a crime occurred, it was up to the victim to prosecute it. And that system was not a tort system, so he didn't get a benefit, but he got private deterrence by having the reputation of prosecuting. But it's sort of an interesting system because it's a little puzzling at first why people prosecuted, and yet they did. Somebody way back there, or up here, whoever. I don't care.
So environmentalism has had its fair share of criticism as like a substitute for socialism, and I would like to ask, in your opinion, is there a system which respects freedom and also somehow ensures that we will have a habitable planet in like 100 years?
I think even without respecting freedom, the answer is no. That is, I don't see any system that guarantees that we will have a habitable planet in 100 years. As it happens, I think that the environmental risks are greatly exaggerated. I gave a talk yesterday in Graz, which I assume will show up on the web at some point, in which I was arguing that it is not at all clear whether the net effects of climate change are good or bad, and that there is no good reason to think they are very bad, which is what this kind of question implies. But so far as the logic of the problem, if they were very bad, I do not see any set of institutions that will reliably prevent them, because preventing climate change is not only a public good problem at the individual level, it's a public good problem at the national level, that if one country restricts its use of fossil fuels to hold down CO2, most of the benefit goes to other countries. So as far as I can tell, where you have a cost which is a very dispersed cost, I don't know of any good mechanisms for controlling such cost. One of the things I discuss in the third edition of Machinery, when I'm talking about what I think of as market failure on the market for law, pollution is one of the examples. Because if I agree to be liable to damages to you for polluting your air, that results in less pollution, and most of the benefit goes to them. And since we aren't going to take account of their benefit, we would expect a below optimal level of pollution control in my system. The similar argument gives you a below optimal level of intellectual property protection, because when you agree to honor my copyrights, that results in my writing more books, which benefits people who aren't honoring my copyrights. So there are a variety of ways in which it's predictably imperfect, but the problem with sort of the way the question is put is that it usually implies that there is some system that will always give us the right answer, and I don't know of any such. And if you look, for example, at environmental protection under the Soviet Union, it was turned out to be much worse than in capitalist countries, not better. And I don't see any reliable solution to that sort of problem. But I think that the world is less fragile than a lot of the talk implies, that people worry about the fact that eventually, if you keep it up long enough, there won't be any ice caps. Well, for most of the history of Earth, there was no ice cap. Do you know what the technical term is for a time in the history of Earth when there was ice on one or both of the poles? It's called an ice age, right? We are currently in an ice age. We're in an interglacial in an ice age. So, if the ice all melts tomorrow, we're going to have a really serious problem because sea level goes up a lot. If the ice all melts in 10,000 years, as far as I know, that's just fine. We can see whether Antarctica is useful for anything. But that'll just be the normal state of the planet over much of its time. So, in a way, I'm reminded of a story about Adam Smith, which is that there was a major American victory during the Revolutionary War. And when the news of that came to Scotland, one of Smith's students came to him and he said, "Mr. Smith, this will be the ruin of England." And Smith replied, "Young man, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. There's also a lot of ruin in a planet."
So technological development may help governments to survive, especially artificial intelligence and the development of manufacturing technologies. So what do you think about the possibility that the production of goods would be so efficient and cheap that basically governments could move into a dystopia or utopia of providing everything for free for every citizen?
I think that's going to be hard because it's not just the cost of production, it's also the decision of what to produce. And it would seem to me that unless you have some good decentralized mechanism like a market, it's going to be very hard to take all of the information everybody wants and figure out what to do. I think it's certainly possible that production will get much better. It's also, there are a number of ways in which technology could make things worse. That's sort of part of the point of my book, Future Imperfect, part of the reason for the title, is that technological change can make things better or worse. You can't easily predict which. That after I published that book, I was asked to give a talk on it at Google. And I started my talk by saying that I thought global warming was a pretty wimpy catastrophe. I had 3 different ways of wiping out the human race faster than that. And I do. I can think of at least 3 lines of technological development that could go in a way that results in there being no humans 100 years from now. I hope they won't. They could also go in ways that would make us like gods or something close to that. That would make us much better off. And what's going to actually happen, I don't know. One of my recent projects is that I'm trying to put together a collection of short works of literature, poems or short stories mostly, that have interesting economics in them. And one of the ones I'm planning to use is in fact relevant to your question in an odd sense. It's a story in which the aliens decide that they will destroy our economy by giving us replicators, by giving us devices which can at essentially no cost copy anything. And the story is sort of from the point of view of the person running a big department store who takes about a day to figure out how in this new world his department store should function. And his department store is now selling the opportunity to replicate many of different things. And you pay for that. They don't have to actually make it. They have one of each thing. But since you wouldn't want to have at home 6,000 different things, it's still a useful service. So I think that markets are pretty flexible in dealing even with very, very productive societies. I think the title is something like Business as Usual After Alterations. It's a neat story that I came across. So if any of you know of a poem or short story that has interesting economics implicit in it, please tell me, because I don't have enough yet.
So which are the 3 ways you could destroy the world?
Nanotechnology via gray goo, biotechnology via a bright high school kid who invents a plague that kills everybody, and artificial intelligence. Because after all, if, as some sensible people have predicted, in another few decades we can make programmed computers that are people as smart as we are, and if the computers keep getting smarter at the rate at which they have been and we don't, 10 or 15 years after that we are gerbils, and we had better hope they like pets.
So I hope I managed to distill my question. But in my interpretation, the state is something that bonds all these communities that lives in the state, within the state. So, for example, right now I'm sitting here with libertarian-minded people, but let's say I got home. And there's my brother who is not interested in this stuff. And the next day I'm going to, this Far Eastern art history exam, and there will be total different people. And what you talked about was all these historic laws. So they were also they were also functioning in different communities. So there was Jewish law, there was Romani law, and they all happened to be centered around ethnicities or religion, or let's say people who speak the same languages. So my interpretation of the state, let's say with the limited government, that it's something that bonds people. It's something that gives us stability. So, of course, if I'm saying limited government, you could say, why not no government? So I don't know if that's really is a question, but what are your thoughts on my idea?
To begin with, I recommend to you a very interesting book called Seeing Like a State by James Scott. because one of the arguments he is making on both theoretical and historical grounds is that states attempt to eliminate the diversity you're describing because that diversity makes it harder to rule people. So that in France, say in 1600, you did not have a uniform language, which meant that if the king sent out officials to Provence, the officials would not have a common language with the people they were trying to regulate. And he argues that governments had a long and eventually largely successful attempt to standardize the people they ruled because it was easier to rule people when they all spoke the same language, they tried to impose uniform naming systems because it's hard to conscript people if you can't identify who is who. They tried to impose reasonably simple and uniform property systems because taxing land is hard if 7 different people have different rights to the same piece of land, and so forth and so on. So his argument, at least, is essentially the opposite of yours. It is that having a state really requires large elements of uniformity. What he's really describing is that you're trying to make the territory more like the map, because you have to use a map in order to coordinate things that's much simpler than the territory really is. More generally, I would have said that generally markets handle diversity much better than political structures do, because in the market, different people can do different things. You could easily enough have, as you did have, in fact, in the Islamic world, that some people follow the Maliki school and some people follow the Shafi'i school, and you're going to have some problems on the interface, but nonetheless, most of the disputes within the Islamic legal system are intra-communal disputes, issues of marriage and things of that sort, and the fact that you can have different ones makes it easier to handle diversity rather than harder. No more questions. Amazing. I have a question. I like markets, and there's a market near here, and I was over at that market a little before I gave this talk, and I thought I was buying half a kilo of very tasty-looking apricots. I think I ended up with something more than a half a kilo, and I'm not going to eat them all. So if any of you would like some apricots, I have got free apricots available, and they seem to be pretty tasty apricots. Thank you all.